Hey chocolate friends, I am excited to talk to you about something that I regularly have to talk about in my chocolate tastings. So, if you're doing chocolate tastings as well, this may be helpful to you. So one of the questions that I'm always asked is either the difference between American chocolate and European chocolate, or why one is better than the other, or the preference between the two. So I'm going to explain a little bit. When you think of American chocolate, the ubiquitous name that comes up is this one, Hershey's chocolate. So there is something in Hershey's chocolate that you don't find in most European chocolates. And that chemical is called butyric acid. Sometimes called butanoic acid and butanoic acid and butyric acid, all the same thing. It's a short chain fatty acid that has 4-carbon background. I'll put a picture of it over here for you to see, a little ball and stick model. Let's see. So where do I want to start? So it's commonly found in its esterified form in animal fats and plant oils. It's naturally found in the human gut, so good bacteria in our gut break down dietary fiber, and one of the products is butyric acid. It's naturally found in butter, obviously, hard cheeses like Parmesan, that smell that you know, Parmesan, that's butyric acid, milk, yogurt, cream, fermented foods, what else? Body odor, vomit, breast milk. It's found in many places naturally. It is a colorless, oily liquid, but it definitely has a penetrating, unpleasant odor. So it was first isolated chemically in 1814 by a French scientist from butter. Butter is about 3 to 4% butyric acid, and it is named after the ancient Greek word for butter. It's commonly used in industrial chemical processes. It's in over 10,000 patents, from air fresheners to paints to drugs to perfume to food. So it's all over the place. Why would you add it to food? Sometimes it's added to food as a preservative because it controls the pH, but not often, because there are other cheaper ways to preserve food than butyric acid. But okay, let's talk about Hershey's specifically, because this is the one that always comes up as having butyric acid. So if you compare American chocolate to European chocolate, American chocolate will often be described as having this tang to it, and that comes from the butyric acid. So Hershey's, which are very cagey, like a lot of big industrial chocolate companies, will not talk about their chocolate formula. They will talk about it in vague terms. So what they have said is that Hershey does not add butyric acid. That's no big deal. But they do acknowledge the presence of lipase. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I mentioned that butyric acid is in milk. It's commonly found in milk. So what happens is there's a process called lipolysis, which means fat breaking down. Lipo means fat, lysis means to break down. So this happens in milk when the fatty acids in milk are broken down into their component parts. Milk has an enzyme in it called lipase, which catalyzes lipolysis. So this breakdown happens in milk to produce butyric acid. Now, if you want to know about how Hershey's versus Nestle came about their formulas, so Nestle were the first one to make milk chocolate. This is an excellent book to read, The Emperors of Chocolate, by Joel Brenner. Great book, history on Hershey's and Nestle and Mars. Really great book, interesting book. You'll love it if you like all things chocolate. So it talks a little bit about the process that Milton Hershey went through to get to his chocolate. So he knew Milton Hershey started off, he was a very successful caramel maker. He had a company called the Lancaster Caramel Co., and he sold it for $1 million at the turn of the, from the 1800s to the 1900s, at the turn of the century. That was a lot of money. I mean, it's a lot of money today, but in the 1900s, it was really a lot of money. And so he didn't start out in chocolate, he started out in caramels. And one of the things that he did with caramel was to add milk instead of wax, which is what people were doing at the time. They were adding paraffin wax to give that chewiness to the caramel. He decided to do milk instead. So he had this background with cooking milk and caramelizing milk. So when he decided to sell his caramel company and switch to chocolate full time, he went through this experimental process. So he had visited factories in Europe, but purposefully wanted to do it his own way. So he went through this whole experimental process in the barn. He knew he wanted to use dairy fresh dairy because he had such success with that in his caramels. So Hershey's will never tell you the formula or how they make this chocolate. But what I will tell you is that it is not a recipe. I don't know it either, but large industrial chocolate is not made via a recipe. You know, if I make a recipe for chocolate chip cookies versus you, it's always going to turn out a little bit different. They have formulas that dictate exact percentages of ingredients, and no accidents happen on these lines. There's no accidental flavor, ingredients going in. Whatever happens on this line is not inadvertently a byproduct. So they do acknowledge that they make their chocolate with fresh dairy milk from local farms, from farms around in Pennsylvania. That's the way they started. They do acknowledge that lipase is in this local milk. They won't say anything specifically about butyric acid, but what some food scientists have speculated is that they take the milk to just barely spoiling so that it has an actual longer shelf life, which is one of the goals that Milton Hershey wanted. He wanted to be able to take chocolate from a luxury product to an everyday product to the masses. So they take it to just barely spoiling, and this creates butyric acid, and it creates a more shelf-stable product. So they've also speculated, food scientists speculate, that in the US, one of the differences is that they cook the milk at a lower temperature, which means there's no caramelization of the sugars, or less caramelization of the sugars, versus in Europe, where they cook the milk at a much higher temperature, and therefore the sugars get caramelized, and there's more caramelized sugar notes in the chocolate itself. So it's not that they're adding butyric acid in, it is the presence of butyric acid, but it's most likely the process that creates butyric acid in Hershey's chocolate. Now, why do we say all American chocolate tastes like that? That's because Hershey's chocolate sells their chocolate to be rebranded all over the place. So many of the things in like the 1930s, 1950s in there were using Hershey's chocolate to create their chocolate confections. So it became a flavor note in American chocolate. Now that's different now with all the different craft makers and stuff and globalization, but it is still a characteristic. So next time you're opening a Hershey bar, compare it to maybe some European chocolate, or think about it when you're tasting it to see if you can taste that tang. So some people will describe it as slightly acidic, some people will describe it as baby vomit, some people will describe it as locker room. It's got all of these things, but the butyric acid is the chemical that gives that odor in all of those other places, and it is in Hershey's milk chocolate. And that's why Americans have a particular taste for Hershey's, whereas the rest of the world sometimes think it tastes a little bit weird. So I hope next time you do a tasting, somebody asks you what's the difference between American chocolate and European chocolate, or why does Hershey's taste like baby vomit, you can tell them that you know the reason, and it's all butyric acid. So that's the bar bits video for today. If you have any questions you want to ask me, leave them down in the comments and I will see if I can answer them about butyric acid or differences in chocolate between the US and Europe. And if you like learning about chocolate or knowing this stuff, subscribe and you'll get a new chocolate video every Thursday. I love talking chocolate with you guys. I'll see you next week.